The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, slipping through the mail slot of Isabella Romano's Brooklyn apartment like a ghost from another life. She had been making coffee when she heard it land, the sharp sound of paper against hardwood breaking the quiet routine of her 25th birthday. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive, with her name written in elegant script that seemed to belong to a different century. No return address, no postage stamp, just her name, and beneath it, a wax seal bearing an insignia she had never seen before, a crown pierced by 3 daggers. Isabella stood in her small kitchen, the morning light filtering through cheap blinds, holding something that felt heavier than paper should feel. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. Inside, a single sheet contained words that would shatter the comfortable fiction of her existence. "You are not who you think you are. They will come for you. The blood of Naples runs in your veins, and debts unpaid do not forgive themselves with time. Trust no one. Come to the address below before the new moon, or they will find you first." The address was in New Jersey, across the river, in a part of the state she had never visited. Below the message, pressed into the paper like a brand, was that same symbol, the Romano family crest, though Isabella did not yet know its meaning. She had lived her entire life believing her mother died of an illness when she was 5, a fever that came suddenly and took her within days. Her father had never been part of the story. Just a mistake, her grandmother had said, a man who disappeared before Isabella was born. The grandmother who raised her in that Brooklyn apartment, who worked double shifts at the hospital, who never spoke of the past, who died 2 years ago taking her secrets to the grave. Isabella called in sick to work that day. She taught elementary school in Queens, a job she loved for its predictability and innocence. Children asked simple questions with simple answers, but the envelope had brought questions that twisted in her stomach like knives. She spent hours searching online for the Romano family crest, finding nothing but references to Italian nobility from centuries past. The address in New Jersey led to a property registered under a legal trust with no public information. Everything about the letter suggested either an elaborate hoax or a truth more dangerous than ignorance. By evening, curiosity and fear had formed a knot she could not untangle. She told her roommate she was visiting a friend upstate for a few days, packed a small bag, and drove across the George Washington Bridge as the sun set behind the Manhattan skyline. The GPS led her through increasingly isolated roads, past strip malls and industrial parks into wooded areas where houses sat far back from the road behind gates and walls. The address belonged to an estate hidden behind iron gates, the kind of property that spoke of old money and older secrets. She parked on the road outside, her compact car looking absurdly out of place. The gate stood open, which felt like either an invitation or a trap. Isabella walked up the long driveway, fallen leaves crunching under her feet, her breath visible in the cold autumn air. The house was a stone mansion, 3 stories of Italian architecture that seemed transported from another continent. Lights glowed in the windows. Someone was expecting her. The front door opened before she could knock. A man in his 60s stood there, tall and lean, with silver hair and eyes that assessed her with an intensity that made her want to run. He wore a suit despite the late hour, perfectly tailored, and when he spoke, his accent carried the music of southern Italy beneath American English perfected over decades. He did not introduce himself. He simply stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. The interior was more museum than home. Marble floors, oil paintings in gilded frames, furniture that looked centuries old and worth more than everything Isabella had ever owned combined. He led her through corridors to a study lined with books, where a fire burned in a stone fireplace. On the desk sat a leather folder and beside it a framed photograph. The photograph showed a woman in her 30s standing on what appeared to be a Mediterranean terrace. She wore a black dress and held herself with the posture of someone accustomed to command. Her face was angular and beautiful, her eyes dark and knowing. Isabella felt the room tilt slightly. The woman in the photograph could have been her own reflection in 20 years. The same sharp cheekbones, the same mouth, the same intensity in the gaze. The man finally spoke, his words measured and careful. He explained that the woman in the photograph was Donatella Romano, and that Donatella had been more than just a woman. She had been the Mafia Queen of Naples, one of the most feared and respected figures in the Italian underworld for nearly 2 decades. She had controlled territories, commanded loyalty through a combination of strategic brilliance and calculated violence, and had survived in a world where women were not supposed to lead. She had been Isabella's mother, The story unfolded like a nightmare dressed in logic. Donatella had come to America 26 years ago, not fleeing but expanding, building connections with families in New York and New Jersey. She had met Isabella's father during that time, a man named Marcus Chen, a financial analyst who had helped launder money through legitimate businesses. Their relationship had been brief, but resulted in a pregnancy that Donatella initially viewed as a complication. But when Isabella was born, something shifted. Donatella, who had built an empire on ruthlessness, discovered she was capable of love. For 5 years, Donatella had tried to maintain both lives, the queen and the mother. She kept Isabella hidden, raised in Brooklyn by her own mother, visiting when she could, trying to build walls between her daughter and the violence that surrounded her work. But the walls had been illusions. When Isabella was 5, a rival family discovered Donatella's greatest vulnerability. They came for the child as leverage, as revenge, as a message to anyone who thought they could challenge the old order. Donatella had responded with a ferocity that became legend. She had eliminated the entire leadership of the rival family in a single night. A purge so complete and so brutal that it sent shockwaves through the international criminal networks. But she understood that as long as she lived, Isabella would remain a target. So Donatella Romano did something no one expected. She faked her own death, staged an illness that supposedly killed her, and disappeared from her daughter's life entirely. For 20 years, Donatella had lived in exile, first in South America, then Southeast Asia, always moving, always watching from a distance as her daughter grew up normal, safe, unburdened by the weight of a crown made of blood and betrayal. She had sent money through untraceable channels, ensuring Isabella's grandmother could provide a good life. She had watched from afar as Isabella went to college, became a teacher, built a life as far from violence as possible. But exile had not meant escape. The old enemies had not forgotten. They had merely been patient, searching through decades for any trace of Donatella's bloodline. 3 months ago, they had found it. A DNA database, a genealogy website, a single sample Isabella had submitted out of curiosity about her heritage. That simple act had lit a beacon for men who never forgot and never forgave. Donatella had received the information too late to stop it, but early enough to prepare. She had written the letter, arranged the meeting, and then disappeared again, not to protect herself, but to draw the hunters away from her daughter, while giving Isabella the tools she would need to survive what was coming. The man who finally introduced himself as Victor Castellano had been Donatella's most trusted advisor. He opened the leather folder and spread documents across the desk. Property deeds, bank accounts, legal trusts, all established in Isabella's name through shell corporations and dummy trustees. Donatella had spent 20 years building a fortress of wealth and power, and she had left it all to her daughter. But money and property were only part of the inheritance. Victor explained that the Romano family had not disappeared with Donatella. It had fragmented, scattered across the United States and Europe, waiting for a leader to reunite them. Many had gone legitimate, investing criminal profits into legal businesses. Others had maintained the old ways, operating in the shadows of import-export companies and construction firms. All of them remembered Donatella Romano, and many would remember their loyalty to her bloodline. The enemies, Victor continued, were not interested in money or territory. They wanted symbolic revenge, the complete erasure of the Romano name. They would come for Isabella not because of anything she had done, but because of what she represented. The daughter of the Mafia Queen carried a debt written in blood before she was born. Isabella listened to all of this sitting in a leather chair that smelled of old tobacco and older secrets. Her hands gripped the armrests so tightly her knuckles went white. Part of her wanted to run, to reject this inheritance and return to her classroom where the most dangerous thing was a paper cut from construction paper. But another part, something deeper and colder, understood that running was not an option anymore. The moment she submitted that DNA sample, the moment her name appeared in that database, her old life had ended. The only question now was whether she would face what was coming as a victim or as something else entirely. She asked Victor what her mother would want her to do. He had smiled then, a sad expression that held decades of memory, and said that Donatella would want her daughter to live by any means necessary. If that meant running and hiding, Donatella would understand. But if Isabella chose to stand and fight, to claim the empire that was her birthright, then Victor and others like him would teach her everything she needed to know. Isabella spent that night in the mansion, in a bedroom that had been prepared for her arrival, lying awake and staring at the ceiling as her entire understanding of herself crumbled and reformed. She thought about her grandmother who had died still protecting secrets. She thought about her mother, a woman she barely remembered, who had given up everything to give her daughter a normal life. She thought about the children she taught, their innocent faces and simple joys, and wondered if she could ever return to that world knowing what she now knew. By morning, she had made her decision. She would not run. She would not hide. If her mother had been strong enough to rule an empire, Isabella would be strong enough to reclaim it, not for power or revenge, but for survival, and perhaps, buried beneath the fear and anger, for the memory of a woman who had loved her enough to become a ghost. The education began immediately. Victor brought in teachers, men and women who had served Donatella, who understood the complex machinery of the underworld. They taught Isabella about the families, the territories, the unwritten codes that governed a world without official laws. She learned about money laundering through legitimate businesses, about the importance of appearances and reputation, about the difference between power that came from fear and power that came from respect. They taught her how to read people, how to identify lies and hidden agendas, how to conduct meetings where every word carried weight and consequences. She learned the history of the Romano family, going back 4 generations to Sicily, understanding how her bloodline had been shaped by centuries of survival in a world that gave women few legitimate paths to power. The physical training came next. Self-defense instructors taught her to move with confidence, to project strength even when she felt weak. She learned to shoot, though the lessons emphasized that weapons were tools of last resort. Once violence began, control ended. The real power, her instructors emphasized, lay in creating situations where violence was unnecessary, where mere reputation and strategic thinking could achieve what bullets could not. Months passed. Isabella stopped calling her roommate, stopped checking her work email, stopped maintaining the fiction of her old life. She lived in the New Jersey mansion, transforming from a school teacher into something harder and more dangerous. She cut her hair shorter, adopted a more severe wardrobe, trained her voice to carry authority rather than warmth. The woman who looked back at her from mirrors became increasingly unfamiliar, and increasingly similar to the woman in that photograph. Victor introduced her to the remnants of her mother's organization, one by one. They came to the mansion for meetings, these men and women who had once served Donatella Romano. Some were skeptical. Isabella was young, untested, raised outside the life. Others saw in her the same intelligence and determination that had made her mother legendary. She listened more than she spoke in those early meetings, learning the dynamics, understanding the personalities, building a mental map of who could be trusted and who merely pretended loyalty. The first test came in January, 6 months after she received the letter. A shipment of legitimate goods, Italian textiles imported through one of the family's legal businesses, was seized by corrupt customs officials who wanted a larger percentage. It was a minor problem, the kind of thing that happened regularly in business, both legal and illegal. But it was also an opportunity for Isabella to demonstrate whether she understood the rules of the world she had entered. Victor advised caution, negotiations, a peaceful resolution that maintained relationships. But Isabella saw something else. She saw an opportunity to send a message. She researched the customs officials, discovered they were already taking money from a rival organization, and compiled evidence of their corruption. Then she made a simple phone call to the regional inspector general, providing the evidence anonymously, and waited. Within 2 weeks, the customs officials were arrested and the shipment was released. The rival organization lost valuable connections, and word spread through the networks that the Romano family had returned with someone who played the game with intelligence rather than violence. It was a small victory, but it established a pattern. Isabella Romano did not need to kill to win. She simply needed to be smarter than her opponents, but intelligence alone would not protect her from the enemies who sought her death. They were coming. Victor received reports of movements, of questions being asked in the right places, of contracts being offered to specialists who made people disappear. The Marchetti family, based in Philadelphia, had taken the lead in hunting for Donatella's daughter. They were old, powerful, and patient. They had waited 20 years for revenge. They would not stop now. Isabella knew she needed allies beyond the scattered remnants of her mother's organization. She reached out to other families, proposing partnerships based on mutual benefit rather than territory or tradition. She met with the heads of Chinese syndicates in New York's Chinatown, with Russian networks operating in Brooklyn, with Colombian operations in New Jersey. She was not seeking to build an empire like her mother's. She was building something more modern, a network of relationships where power came from cooperation rather than domination. Some accepted her proposals, seeing opportunities in working with someone who understood both the old world and the new. Others rejected her, viewing a woman leader as a weakness to be exploited. Isabella noted who accepted and who rejected, understanding that allies and enemies were often separated by nothing more than timing and opportunity. By summer, a year after receiving the letter, Isabella had transformed the Romano organization from a fragmented legacy into something functional and profitable. The legitimate businesses generated steady income. The less legitimate operations ran smoothly under layers of legal protection. She had learned to navigate both worlds, to present herself as a respectable businesswoman in boardrooms while commanding loyalty in back rooms where darker business was conducted. But the Marchetti family had not forgotten their vendetta. They struck in August, targeting not Isabella directly but the people around her. A warehouse fire killed 3 workers at one of her import businesses. A trusted advisor was severely beaten after leaving a restaurant. A building she owned in Newark was vandalized with graffiti that read, "The daughter pays for the mother's sins." Victor urged her to respond with force, to remind the Marchetti family why people had feared Donatella Romano. But Isabella saw that responding with violence would only validate their narrative, that she was just another criminal to be eliminated. Instead, she researched the Marchetti family's operations, identifying their vulnerabilities. She discovered they were heavily invested in real estate development, with several major projects dependent on city contracts and political connections. Isabella used her legitimate business contacts to identify corruption in the Marchetti construction projects, code violations, bribery, union issues. She compiled evidence and leaked it strategically to journalists and prosecutors. Within months, the Marchetti family faced investigations, project delays, and financial pressures that threatened their legitimate empire. The message was clear. Attacking Isabella Romano meant attacking yourself. But the Marchetti patriarch, Antonio Marchetti, was a man in his 70s who had built his power through a combination of violence and cunning. He responded to Isabella's pressure campaign by escalating. He sent a message through intermediaries: meet face to face, alone, or the attacks would continue and people she cared about would die. Victor argued against the meeting. It was clearly a trap, an opportunity to eliminate Isabella under the pretense of negotiation. But Isabella understood that refusing would make her appear weak, afraid, and that reputation mattered more than physical safety in the world she now inhabited. She agreed to the meeting, setting conditions: neutral territory, limited security on both sides, and witnesses who could verify what transpired. The meeting took place in a restaurant in Atlantic City, chosen because it was neutral ground between New York and Philadelphia territories. Isabella arrived wearing a black dress and the diamond pendant Victor had given her, the same pendant Donatella Romano had worn in that photograph. She had learned that symbols mattered in this world, that appearances could communicate more than words. Antonio Marchetti was already seated when she arrived, surrounded by 3 bodyguards who projected menace through their mere presence. He was smaller than she had imagined, a man diminished by age but not by will. His eyes held the cold assessment of someone who had ordered deaths the way other people ordered dinner. When Isabella sat across from him, she felt the weight of history. This man had tried to kill her as a child, had hunted her mother, had carried vengeance across decades. The conversation was formal, almost ritualistic. Antonio spoke of the old days, of how Donatella had disrupted the traditional order, how she had broken unwritten rules by claiming power that should have belonged to men. He spoke of sons and brothers lost in the purge Donatella had ordered, of a debt that could only be paid in blood. Isabella listened without interrupting, understanding that he needed to speak these grievances aloud, to justify to himself what he intended to do. When he finished, Isabella responded with a calmness that surprised even herself. She spoke of cycles of violence that served no one, of how the old ways were dying as the world changed, of how his vendetta against her mother had already cost his family more than it had gained. She presented financial records showing how the investigations into his construction projects would bankrupt his organization within 2 years, how his children and grandchildren would inherit nothing but legal bills, and prison sentences. Then she made an offer. She would use her connections to make some of the investigations disappear, to smooth over certain legal problems in exchange for peace. Not friendship, not alliance, just the absence of violence between their families. She would even provide compensation for the sons and brothers lost in Donatella's purge, not as admission of guilt, but as acknowledgement of grief. Antonio Marchetti laughed, a harsh sound without humor. He told her she was naive, that she did not understand how this world worked, that some debts could only be paid in blood. He stood to leave, his bodyguards moving with him. But before he reached the door, Isabella spoke again, her voice carrying across the restaurant. She told him she knew about his grandson, the 12-year-old boy who lived in suburban Philadelphia with his mother, Antonio's daughter-in-law. She knew the boy's school, his soccer practices, his favorite pizza place. She said this not as a threat but as a demonstration. If she could find the boy, if she had chosen to play the game by the old rules, she could have done what Antonio intended to do to her. But she had not, because she was offering a different path. The restaurant went silent. Antonio turned slowly, his face a mask of rage and calculation. The implications were clear. Isabella Romano could hurt him as deeply as he intended to hurt her, but she was choosing restraint, not from weakness, but from strength. The ball was in his court. He could continue the vendetta and lose everything, or he could accept her offer and preserve what remained of his legacy for his grandchildren. Antonio Marchetti left without another word. For weeks, Isabella waited for his response, unsure whether it would come as acceptance or violence. Victor increased security around her, preparing for the worst. But when the response finally came, it arrived in the form of a lawyer's letter. Antonio was accepting her offer. The vendetta was over. The settlement was negotiated over months, with lawyers and intermediaries handling the details. Isabella made good on her promises, using connections and favors to ease the legal pressures on Marchetti businesses. In return, Antonio publicly declared that the Romano family debt was settled, a statement that carried weight throughout the northeastern criminal networks. Isabella had achieved what her mother never could, peace through negotiation rather than dominance through fear. But peace with one enemy revealed the presence of others. As Isabella's reputation grew, as she consolidated control over her mother's legacy and built new alliances, other families began to see her as a threat. Some approached with offers of partnership. Others began testing her boundaries, probing for weaknesses, waiting for an opportunity to strike. The winter brought new challenges. A shipment of her goods was hijacked on the New Jersey Turnpike. A restaurant she owned in Brooklyn was robbed at gunpoint. Minor incidents individually, but together they formed a pattern. Someone was testing her responses, trying to determine if Isabella Romano was truly worthy of her mother's reputation, or merely trading on an inherited name. Isabella responded with precision and patience. She identified the parties responsible, not through violence but through information networks she had cultivated. She discovered that the attacks were coordinated by a younger generation of criminals who had never known Donatella, who saw the traditional families as dinosaurs waiting to die, who believed the future belonged to those willing to abandon all rules. This was a different kind of threat, not a vendetta based on the past, but an opportunistic challenge based on perceived weakness. Isabella understood that her previous strategy of evidence and legal pressure would not work against people who operated entirely outside legitimate structures. She needed to send a different kind of message. She authorized a response not by her own people, but through allies in other organizations who owed her favors. The message was simple. Those who attacked Romano interests would find themselves attacked in turn, not by Isabella directly, but by a coalition of families who had decided that maintaining order served everyone's interests. The coordinated response was swift and effective. Within weeks, the challengers had been neutralized, their operations disrupted, their leadership scattered. The lesson was not lost on other potential challengers. Isabella Romano had demonstrated that she could play both games, the civilized game of business and law and the brutal game of street-level power. She was neither purely legitimate nor purely criminal, but something more complex, someone who understood that true power came from being able to move between worlds. 2 years after receiving that cream-colored envelope, Isabella stood in the same New Jersey mansion where her education had begun, preparing for a meeting that would define her position in the landscape she now inhabited. The major families from New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania had requested a summit, a gathering to discuss territories, agreements, and the future of their shared interests. It was recognition. Isabella Romano was no longer Donatella's daughter trying to survive. She was a player in her own right. The meeting took place in the mansion's main hall, a room large enough for the assembled representatives. Isabella had spent days preparing, understanding that first impressions in such gatherings could establish hierarchies that lasted decades. She wore the black dress from the photograph, the diamond pendant that had become her signature, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. The discussions lasted hours. Territory divisions, profit-sharing arrangements, protocols for resolving disputes. Isabella participated as an equal, neither deferring to the older families nor overreaching her actual power. She proposed a system of arbitration for conflicts, a way to resolve problems without violence that would attract law enforcement attention. Some of the older heads resisted, viewing it as weakness. But the younger generation understood that times had changed, that public violence brought scrutiny that hurt everyone's interests. By the end of the summit, agreements had been reached. Isabella's territories were recognized, her businesses accepted as legitimate parts of the ecosystem, her voice acknowledged in future discussions. She had achieved what she set out to do, transform from a target into a leader, from someone to be eliminated into someone to be respected. But the cost had been high. Isabella barely recognized the woman she had become. The teacher who loved children's laughter felt like a distant memory, someone who had existed in another lifetime. The woman who looked back from mirrors now was harder, colder, someone who made decisions that affected lives and livelihoods without hesitation. She had gained power and security, but lost the innocence that had made her previous life meaningful. Victor noticed the change. He had watched Donatella undergo a similar transformation decades earlier, had seen how the crown of power grew heavier with time. He asked Isabella once if she regretted her choice, if she wished she had run when she had the chance. She had considered the question seriously before answering. That regret implied the existence of real choices, and from the moment her DNA appeared in that database, her choices had been an illusion. She could become what she needed to be, or she could die. Those were the only options. The final chapter of her transformation came 3 years after that first letter, when news reached her that Donatella Romano was alive. The information arrived through encrypted channels, a message from her mother after 2 decades of silence. Donatella had been living in Argentina under an assumed identity, following her daughter's progress from a distance, watching as Isabella built something more sophisticated than the empire she herself had commanded. The message contained coordinates for a meeting, a remote location outside Buenos Aires, and a date 2 weeks away. It was signed simply, "Your mother," as if 20 years of abandonment could be summarized in 2 words. Isabella stared at the message for hours, feeling emotions she had trained herself to suppress: anger at being abandoned, relief that her mother was alive, fear of what a reunion might mean. She told Victor she was going, despite his arguments about safety and logistics. This was not about strategy or power. This was about the woman in the photograph, the mother she barely remembered, the ghost who had shaped her life from a distance. Isabella needed to look Donatella Romano in the eyes and understand why. Why abandon a daughter? Why build an empire knowing it would destroy everything she touched? Why pass on a burden that no child should carry? The flight to Buenos Aires was long, giving Isabella time to prepare what she would say. But when she finally stood in that remote villa outside the city, looking at a woman in her 50s who still carried herself like a queen despite years of exile, all the prepared speeches vanished. Donatella looked older than in the photograph, marked by time and distance, but the eyes were the same, dark and knowing, carrying decades of decisions that could never be undone. They sat across from each other in a garden where jasmine grew wild, and the sound of the city was distant enough to be forgotten. Donatella spoke first, her voice carrying the same authority Isabella had learned to project. She explained that watching from a distance had been the hardest thing she had ever done, harder than any decision she had made as Mafia Queen. She had wanted to reach out 1,000 times, to call, to visit, to simply hold her daughter again. But she understood that any contact would have put Isabella at risk, would have drawn the hunters closer. She told Isabella that the DNA database had been monitored by her enemies for years, that they had agents inside the company, that the moment Isabella's sample appeared, alarms had sounded across networks that never forgot. Donatella had tried to warn her daughter, to prepare her, but had known that no preparation could truly be adequate. So she had done the only thing possible, given Isabella the tools to survive, and stepped back to let her daughter forge her own path. Isabella listened, feeling anger rise like a tide. She spoke of the life that had been stolen, of the innocence that could never be recovered, of becoming something she never wanted to be. She asked her mother if power had been worth the price, if ruling an empire of fear and violence had truly been a victory, if the crown was worth the blood it required. Donatella did not defend her choices. She simply said that she had been young when power first became available and had not understood that crowns cannot be removed once worn. She had thought she could control it, could build something and then walk away. But power does not release people who seize it. It transforms them, corrupts them, makes them into instruments of its own perpetuation. By the time she understood what she had become, it was too late to change course. She could only try to protect the one thing she loved more than power. The conversation lasted hours. Through afternoon into evening, two women bound by blood and circumstance trying to bridge a gap wider than geography. There was no reconciliation, no Hollywood ending where understanding led to forgiveness. But there was acknowledgement. Donatella acknowledged the burden she had passed on, and Isabella acknowledged that her mother's choices, however flawed, had come from love rather than cruelty. Before Isabella left, Donatella gave her a piece of advice, the only inheritance that mattered. She told her daughter to remember that power was a tool, not an identity, and that the measure of a leader was not how much fear they inspired, but how many people they protected. Donatella had failed to understand that distinction until too late. Perhaps Isabella could succeed where her mother had failed, building something that served more than ego and survival. Isabella returned to New Jersey carrying that advice like a weight and a gift combined. She looked at her organization differently now, understanding that she could choose what it became. It did not have to be a criminal empire built on fear. It could be a hybrid structure that protected people who had nowhere else to turn, that operated in gray areas where law and justice did not always align, that made money without leaving bodies in its wake. Over the following months, she began shifting the organization's focus. The purely criminal operations were gradually phased out or transferred to other families in exchange for favors and influence. The legitimate businesses grew stronger, providing jobs and opportunities to people who might otherwise have no options. She established foundations and charities that cleaned money while also doing genuine good, scholarships for children from difficult backgrounds, support for women escaping abuse, programs for former criminals trying to rebuild lives. It was not redemption. Isabella understood she could never erase what she had become or undo the decisions she had made, but it was evolution, a choice to use the power she had gained for something beyond survival and revenge. She would never be the school teacher again, would never return to that innocent life, but perhaps she could be something else, someone who understood both the darkness and the light, who could navigate between worlds, who could protect rather than destroy. The final test of her transformation came on a cold November evening. 5 years after receiving that cream-colored envelope, the Marchetti family, despite the treaty, faced internal crisis. Antonio's son had died of cancer, and his grandson, the 12-year-old boy Isabella had mentioned in that Atlantic City restaurant, was now 17 and being pulled into the family business by uncles who saw him as a tool for regaining power. The boy's mother had reached out desperately, begging Isabella for help protecting her son from a legacy that would destroy him. Isabella could have refused. The treaty required peace, not intervention in internal Marchetti affairs. But she saw in that boy's situation a mirror of her own, a child being forced to inherit debts and violence they did not earn, being shaped into something against their nature to serve other people's agendas. She understood that true leadership meant making choices that served principles rather than convenience. She used her influence and connections to create opportunities for the boy, a scholarship to a college across the country, a legal job at one of her legitimate companies, a path away from the family business that would not shame or endanger him. It required negotiations, favors, and promises to the Marchetti uncles who saw their instrument slipping away. But Isabella persisted, understanding that every child saved from this life was a small victory against the cycle that had consumed so many lives, including her own. The boy left for college that spring, and his mother sent Isabella a letter of gratitude that mentioned prayers and blessings. Isabella kept that letter in the desk drawer where she also kept the original envelope with the Romano family crest. They represented different kinds of inheritance, one of violence and burden, one of gratitude and hope. She could not erase the first, but perhaps she could build enough of the second to balance the scales. The years continued. Isabella Romano became a fixture in both the legitimate and shadow worlds, someone whose name carried weight in boardrooms and backrooms alike. She never forgot where she came from, both the Brooklyn apartment where she grew up and the Neapolitan bloodline that had shaped her destiny. She carried both identities, refusing to deny either, understanding that her power came from being able to move between worlds that most people saw as completely separate. Donatella died in Argentina when Isabella was 32, peaceful in her sleep after 7 years of exile. Isabella flew south for a private funeral, standing beside the grave of a woman the world believed had died decades earlier. There were no grand eulogies, no crowds of mourners, just a daughter saying goodbye to a mother who had loved her in the only way she knew how, by becoming a ghost so her child could live. Isabella inherited nothing material from that death. Donatella had already given everything to her daughter years before, but she inherited understanding, a deeper comprehension of how easily good intentions could become disasters, how power could corrupt even love, how the choices people made could echo across generations in ways they never intended. Now at 35, Isabella Romano stood before the assembled heads of the northeastern families in that same New Jersey mansion where her education had begun. A new generation was rising, children of the old bosses who questioned the traditional ways, who saw opportunity in the changing world, who wanted to know if the Romano family would evolve with them or cling to the past. She wore the black dress and diamond pendant that had become her signature, standing where her mother's photograph hung on the wall, a reminder of history and a promise of something different. The rain beat against the villa windows, the sound like the ticking of a clock measuring out moments that would define futures. When Isabella spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had earned their position through intelligence, strategy, and the willingness to make difficult choices. She told them that the old world was dying, that the families could evolve or disappear, that power in the new century would belong to those who understood that strength came from intelligence rather than fear, from building networks rather than territories, from protecting communities rather than exploiting them. Some nodded in agreement, seeing wisdom in her words. Others remained skeptical, unable to imagine abandoning the methods that had served their families for generations. But all of them listened, because Isabella Romano had proven herself through a decade of leadership, because she commanded respect earned rather than inherited, because she represented something they grudgingly admired, the ability to transform burden into power, victimhood into leadership, legacy into choice. As the meeting concluded and the families departed into the November rain, Isabella stood alone in the hall where her education had begun. She thought about the teacher she had been, the woman she had become, the leader she was still learning to be. The journey had been longer and stranger than anything she could have imagined when she opened that cream-colored envelope on her 25th birthday. She had not chosen this path, but she had chosen how to walk it, and that choice made all the difference. Her mother had been the Mafia Queen of Naples, ruling through fear and violence. Isabella Romano would be something different, a leader who understood the value of power but refused to be defined by it, who carried her mother's strength but chose a different kind of legacy. The enemies who had wanted the Mafia Queen dead had gotten her daughter instead. But what they received was not a copy of Donatella Romano. It was something more complex, more dangerous, and ultimately more effective. A woman who learned from history rather than repeating it, who built bridges rather than walls, who understood that true power came not from how much fear you inspired, but from how many people stood with you by choice rather than coercion. As Isabella walked through the mansion toward her office to prepare for the next challenge, the next negotiation, the next impossible decision, she carried with her the weight and wisdom of two women, the teacher who believed in innocence, and the queen who understood darkness. She would never fully be either again, but perhaps she could be both, and in that combination, forge something new. The rain continued falling on the New Jersey estate, washing the world clean while the shadows within remained complex and unresolved. And Isabella Romano, daughter of the Mafia Queen, stood ready for whatever came next, not because she wanted to, but because she had learned the most important lesson power teaches. The crown cannot be removed once worn, but it can be shaped into something different than those who came before ever imagined. Thank you for joining Isabella's journey from innocence to power, from victim to leader. If you enjoyed this story of transformation, legacy, and the complex paths we walk when choice collides with fate, please subscribe to the channel for more emotionally engaging tales that explore the depths of human experience. Every story here is crafted to take you into worlds where decisions matter, where characters face impossible choices, and where the line between hero and villain is never quite as clear as we wish it would be. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of listeners who appreciate narratives that challenge, move, and stay with you long after the final words fade.